Okay, well, thank you, everybody. I'm Faisal Islam, the BBC's economics editor. Thank you very much for being here for the final session of this conference, a really very important session, trying to bring together some of the strands you've been talking to over the past couple of days through the lens of the world economy. I've just got to say that this session is on the record and it's being recorded and will be available on demand on the conference platform after the conference. Please tweet using the hashtag #C_H_London. And we're really keen to get in this last session lots and lots of questions. So we're going to have 3 minutes from each of the participants who I'll introduce in a moment. And then should be about half an hour for questions on the world's economic challenges, as many and varied as they are. So I will begin, I'll quickly introduce the panel, some of whom need little or no introduction. We have just joining us via video link, 3 members there. We have the former Chancellor, Lord Hammond of Runnymede. We have Nouriel Roubini, the obviously famous economist. We have Attiya Waris, who's a professor and the UN independent expert on foreign debt. And with me is Greene, economist, chief economist for Kroll and a fellow here at Chatham House. And of course, Jonathan Haskel, Professor Jonathan Haskel, an external member of the Bank of England's Monetary Policy Committee. So we have the whole gamut of things you would want to discuss here. My perspective, obviously I'm an economics journalist. We try and turn all the currents that you describe into television, which is quite a challenge. But sometimes I just look for the kind of the thing, the object, the moment that kind of helps explain everything. And my challenge in the past 6 months has been trying to get from an early stage, and I note the presence of the Qatari representative in the previous session, a tanker of liquefied natural gas on television from January. And it's obviously, for obvious reasons, quite difficult to get shots of these LNG tankers, but we were tracking them on the marinetraffic.com, and we were seeing where, and they were literally going in different directions, going to different ports and stuff. But eventually we got lucky, climbed over a few bunkers and got a clean shot of something coming in to the Isle of Greene. And I had to do this piece of camera with this ship moving slowly behind me. And I'm thinking, and this wasn't the exact ship, but the story I was telling was of how one of the LNG ships had gone through the Suez Canal and then got to Hawaii and was destined to go from America to offload into China. And so high was the price being paid in Europe that it did a U-turn at Hawaii, came back through the Suez Canal and offloaded into the UK system. And then the other thing here is that apparently it didn't even go to the UK, the gas. The gas then gets put in a pipeline to Europe because we don't have any storage here. So I just thought it was extraordinary to think that a third of a supply of the UK's winter demand was on that one ship. And basically market games and geopolitics were sending this traffic in all sorts of different directions. And within 6 months, we hear from the German Chancellor, Germans, trying desperately to build up infrastructure just to accept these ships, given the geopolitical situation we're in. So we're going to try and tie together all those currents. I'm going to invite Lord Hammond, Philip Hammond, to just open up with 3 or 4 minutes of his views on where we are on the world economy. Philip.
Thank you, Faisal. I wanted to just start from the premise that if we want to look forward, we have to be clear about where we are actually starting from. And I think we've got to be careful not to fall into the delusion of blaming the war in Ukraine for everything. So let's look at where we are post-COVID. Even before the COVID epidemic hit, we had started decoupling supply chains. Americans in their trade war with China, and putting a lot of pressure on Europeans to follow suit. The British people in the Brexit decision effectively decoupling supply chains with Europe. In this process, there is a trade-off between resilience and efficiency, if you want to put it in economics terms, although, of course, many of the motivations were primarily political. So that's number one. Number two, of course, many of the challenges that we're facing today, many of the issues that are current, that are making us ask these questions, derive from the response to COVID itself, the stimulus that was provided during the COVID pandemic, with incomes supported and consumption and output reduced, savings increasing, and inevitably, as this process unwinds, that is bound to deliver inflationary pressure into the system. I remember when we started quantitative easing during the global financial crisis, the big question was, how do we unwind all this? How do we deal with the aftermath? We never actually answered that question, nor did we ever unwind before we got into the next crisis that required quantitative easing. And you know, I have to say, maybe my approach is too unsophisticated, but I remember when Robert Mugabe was financing his deficit by having the Central Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe print dollars, we condemned the inevitability of this action as being hideously inflationary. And now we're seeing some of those consequences ourselves. The third thing that I'd like to touch on is the energy market. Obviously, there's a short-term post-COVID spike around mismatch of supply and demand. But what it's exposing here is a long-term underinvestment in energy. And unfortunately, because you know the reality always reasserts itself over the wish list, that means an underinvestment in hydrocarbons. Gas will need to be part of our future energy equation for many, many years to come, and is a key part of a key element of being able to effectively decarbonize. And I think what we've seen over the last 6 months is that when the chips are down, affordability and security are possibly higher priority political issues in the short term than decarbonisation. So we have to address the balance of these three issues. And the truth, uncomfortable for many people, is that this coming winter, many of us in the decarbonising West will be generating electricity by burning coal. So we have to work out how we go forward with decarbonisation with the consent of the people, which is essential in a democracy. And then there are other short-term post-COVID effects like shipping, supply, demand imbalance, and finally the war itself that has imposed additional shocks on the supply chain, some of which will be structural. I can't see us reopening our markets to many classes of Russian goods anytime soon. So where do we go in terms of the future? I think we're going to need to take a decision about our future relationship with China. Do we want China inside the global system or outside it? My answer is very clear. We need China inside the system, and we need to design an architecture that can accommodate China and contain China within the system. The US and Europe may end up reaching different conclusions on this. Secondly, we need to work out what the correct balance is between resilience and efficiency in supply chains. How do we build supply chains that are resilient enough for our national security needs as well as our economic needs, but which are also efficient enough not to represent a massive reduction in living standards through undoing the benefits of globalization over the last 30, 40 years. Thirdly, we need to work out how we're going to deliver decarbonization with an agenda that represents both realism and has the consent of the people in countries where the consent of the people matters. That is to say, liberal democracies where policies that do not have consent cannot be applied. And I suspect we will also have to have a very difficult international discussion about some form of border adjustment mechanism to deal with the reality that different parts of the world will move at different speeds towards decarbonization and cannot allow themselves to be undercut by those who are moving less quickly to decarbonize. Finally, a very big issue to throw in the last 10 seconds, but we're going to have to resolve what I will call the challenge of liberal democracy. How do we make difficult long-term decisions in our own economic best interest when governments in office at best are being sniped at by populists and at worst have actually been captured by populists? How do we match the decision-making power of the authoritarian regimes like China in liberal democracies where the people making the decisions have to get re-elected every 4 or 5 years?
Thank you very much, Lord Hammond there. Fascinating set of dilemmas for us to chew into. All the questions are coming in, so do send those in. Let's go to Professor Jonathan Haskel, external member of the MPC and Economist.
Thanks very much, Faisal. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to make 2 broad points, if I may. The first is around our medium-term issues, and the key medium-term issue facing the British economy is exactly the same issue that was facing the economy when Philip Hammond was Chancellor, and that is productivity growth. And what we need is an economic system which encourages investment in intangible assets, because they are the assets which Western countries are increasingly investing in, and they are the assets which drive productivity growth. That's the first main point. Second main point, I have the honour to sit on the Bank of England's Monetary Policy Committee, so I'm going to have to defend our record on inflation. And I'd like to say this. It is, of course, people in this audience, this is an international audience and they won't fall into this trap, but it's easy to fall into the trap of confusing the American experience and the European experience. They're quite different. America emerged from the pandemic, as Lord Hammond was just saying, with very strong fiscal support and a high demand supported by an active fiscal policy. We had very active fiscal policy in Europe, but there wasn't quite so much pressure of demand. That's point one. Point two is the gas price shock in Europe, per the tankers, Faisal, that you were just talking about, the gas price shock in Europe has been miles more than that in America because the markets are so disconnected. So gas prices are 3-4 times the level they are in America. And you see that in the inflation numbers. So the high American inflation, about a quarter of that, is due to energy. The high European inflation, around 56%, is due to energy, with Britain somewhat in between. So if you're going to look for a culprit for current inflation, at least in Europe, I do not believe we should be looking towards reckless monetary and fiscal policy. We should be looking much more towards the cause of it being energy. Let me stop at that point. Thanks very much, Faisal.
Okay. Right. Now we're going to go to Professor Attiya Waris, an independent expert on foreign debts. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I am enjoying this conversation because I can recognize some reflections which include my own. I think I come from a slightly different perspective, and that is the whole issue of not only foreign debt and international financial obligations, but their implications for human rights. And specifically, when I say human rights, I'm really looking at the alleviation of poverty. And currently, poverty is a global problem. There isn't a single country in the world that does not have a desperately poor population, no matter where you are. And so for me, it is about 4 key points, which is the first one is about issues around fiscal legitimacy. And for me, fiscal legitimacy includes issues around transparency and accountability, responsibility, effective and efficient systems, which Philip has also mentioned, as well as fair and just systems. And when I come to issues around the SDGs, where we are really behind the curve now at a global level, then it is not just about human rights broadly, it's also about raising living standards, which takes me back to what is this global economic system and what is it meant to serve? And it's really supposed to be a people-centered system. And for me, that is what looking forward should continue to be all about, despite these multiple crises and frankly, desperate problems across the world. Now, when I look at all of these, this is the last, my way forward, my looking forward in this entire conversation, is we need to make sure that if there is accountability, then where is that accountability most pressing? And for me, it is most pressing in the financial system, in the economic system. And if I give the example of illicit financial flows, we have a serious problem globally because there is a lack of transparency in that whole space. And as a result, there's a lack of accountability. And we can see both developed and developing countries are going through crises with companies in their geographical borders because they are not following through with the ability to collect the correct amount of tax from them with existing legal policy systems. The think the issues of responsibility is about democratic spaces. And unfortunately, a lot of the discussions around the economy, around treaties to do with economics, do not take place in democratic spaces. And I think it's really important that as we move towards better international cooperation and discussions and transfers of technology, which I think Philip is also referring to a little bit, that while we are decoupling these economies, at a regional level, for example, in the African continent, actually economies are now coming together. So, and it's really important to keep those in mind. When you look at issues around the Commonwealth, I mean, there is a different group of economies now starting to tighten together as well. And very importantly, when I look at the issue around fairness and justice, for me, it is about these digital economies that we are also looking at. And the digital economy is not being handled properly. It is not being managed. We are not even able to grapple with a lot of it because data is not very accessible to governments, which is very unfortunate. But there are also alternative systems. And these alternative systems include things like ethical banking. Islamic banking is another one that is a fairly stable system. And as we're talking about this global crisis, we have alternatives, and I think it's time that we start looking at them more seriously. But in my closing, I want to say that for me, when we look at the economic system, whether it is a global or a regional level, these economic systems are there to serve the purpose of ensuring that we are raising living standards of people across the world. And if I use the lens of human rights, for me, it is that the rights, they require financial resources that will come from the economic system. But also at the same time, these resources are meant for us to ensure that we raise living standards. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Professor. Let's move on to Nouriel Roubini. Floor is yours.
Thank you, Faisal. I would like to address the question of whether, what's the outlook for the global economy, both in terms of growth and inflation and implication for financial markets. Will central banks be able to bring back inflation to 2%? Are we going to have a soft landing or a hard landing? Are we going to end up into stagflation? And so on. To answer these questions, we have to address several questions that have been open debates in the policy and economic debate. Question number one that was raging last year was whether the rise in inflation in advanced economies was transitory, temporary, or more persistent and permanent. I think that question has been settled. Even central banks and fiscal authority now admit that for a number of reasons, the rise in inflation in US and Europe and other advanced economy was persistent rather than being temporary. The second question is, of course, the question of whether the rise in inflation was driven by excessive aggregate demand, loose monetary and fiscal policy, excess savings and pent-up demand, or whether driven by stagflationary negative aggregate supply shocks, the COVID lockdowns, the bottlenecks in global supply chains, the impact of the Russian invasion of Ukraine on commodity prices, and the impact on supply chains coming from the zero COVID policy of China. The answer to this question depends on where you are. In the US, maybe more aggregate demand. In Europe, maybe aggregate supply. But even in the United States, these supply shocks have been important. The fact that these supply shocks are external and exogenous should be not much of a comfort to central bankers because they are stagflationary. They reduce economic growth, they increase inflation, and therefore they make likelihood of a hard landing greater. The third debate this year, of course, is as central banks now are fighting inflation by raising policy rates, whether that's going to lead to a soft landing with a slowdown of growth without a recession, or a hard landing with a recession and a rise in unemployment rate. My view has been that we're going to end up into a hard landing because in the case of the United States, anytime inflation has been above 5% and unemployment rate below 5%, any attempt to tighten monetary policy has led to a hard landing. And even Powell the other day suggested that achieving a soft landing is going to be very challenging. Many economists now expect a hard landing. Even most of the sell-side research on Wall Street is in that camp. So unfortunately, I think we're going to end up into a hard landing rather than a soft landing. The fourth question is whether central banks are going to remain committed to be hawkish to fight inflation, or whether at some point they're going to blink and wimp out. In my view, at some point, there is a risk they're going to blink and wimp out because of two reasons. As the chances of a hard landing becomes greater, then political pressure to avoid it, to be looser monetary policy and postpone the tightening is going greater. Two, there is so much debt in the system, private and public, that monetary policy tightening is going to lead to a crash in financial market, bond market, credit markets, equity markets. And we already have seen how even a mild tightening has led to significant correction in global financial markets. And therefore, at some point, we're going to wimp out, we're going to end up with higher inflation and potentially stagflation. And the final question I think is important to answer is, now there is a greater consensus that the hard landing is going to occur. The question is how hard the hard landing is going to be. Most people in the soft landing camp now arguing, yes, we might have a recession, but it's going to be shallow, it's going to be garden right, it's going to be vanilla, because as soon as we go in a recession, there'll be slack in goods and labor market, inflation is going to go back to target, and therefore it's going to be shallow recession. I think that view is somehow naive, because we live in a world in which there is so much debt. Private and public debt as a share of GDP globally is 150%. In the advanced economies, 420, that many financial institutions, household, corporates, government, countries that were zombie, they were essentially insolvent, out during COVID with zero policy rates, negative QE, quantitative easing, credit easing, and you name it. This time around, we're going to enter a recession at the time that inflation is rising, central bank can't monetary policy like they did after the GFC or after the COVID crisis. So not only at risk of stagflation, but of a stagflationary debt crisis, where many of these unsustainable debts are going to emerge and lead to something more severe than just a plain recession. Final observation, markets are already into bear market, 20%, but even with a mild vanilla recession, it tends to fall by at least 35%, closer to 50%, the recession associated with financial distress or a financial or a debt crisis. So I think market can go further south. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Great. Okay, thanks there, Professor Roubini. Megan.
You brought me in to cheer everyone up so you all hurl yourself at the windows, right? I'm not sure I'm actually going to be able to. So I'm first going to talk about inflation. Across the developed world, outside the U.S., it's very clear that inflation is primarily driven by supply side constraints. But in the U.S., there is a bigger debate where it's partly demand, partly supply, and that has very different implications for what central banks can do. Now, central banks can't do anything about supply side constraints. They can't do anything about energy costs. They can't do anything about China's zero COVID policy and subsequent lockdowns. All central banks can do is what they call engage in aggregate demand management, which in this case means often. So the Fed's just come out with a study, the San Francisco Fed, showing that about half of the inflation in the U.S. is driven by supply-side factors, about a third is driven by demand-side factors, and the remaining is a little bit ambiguous. And I think that jives with what my assumptions have been as well. That means that while the ECB and the Bank of England have a hard time doing anything about inflation because it's primarily supply-driven, the Fed does have a role to play in killing off demand. That's the idea. That's the intention. So we're going to see the Fed hiking it's pretty aggressively killing off demand. And I agree with Nouriel. I like to say that maybe the Fed can engineer a soft landing, but it's a bit like the Fed trying to thread a needle while wearing oven mitts blindfolded. Technically possible, but not very likely, particularly because unemployment is around 3.5%. The past 3 times that the Fed has engineered a soft landing in its entire history, unemployment was much higher at the start. When you see unemployment ticking up, that means companies are laying people off. It also means that consumers are starting to retrench. That's what pitches you into a recession. So I think it's going to be really difficult to avoid a recession this time around, particularly in the U.S. And of course, Europe has been disproportionately impacted by the war in Ukraine. And that is my base scenario for Europe this year already. And then I think we'll see a recession in Europe starting next year. The good news is that a recession is imminent, particularly in the U.S. It's worth pointing out that the government pushed $2.5 trillion out into household bank accounts. There's about $2.1 trillion left. There is a big cash cushion in aggregate that consumers are sitting on. So it's going to take a while to burn through that cash cushion. American consumers are saving significantly now. There's a ways to go before they start really retrenching. It's the same on the corporate side as well. Companies have built up a huge cash cushion. So while rates are going up and earnings are probably going down, there's a big cash cushion that we're going to see before we start seeing defaults. If the Fed in particular is hiking rates aggressively, I think it's worth pointing out that there are big implications for emerging markets. So I do think that we have the conditions for an emerging market sovereign debt crisis. We've got rates rising, borrowing costs in emerging markets. Emerging markets were over-leveraged before the pandemic, then they had to borrow to fight the pandemic. Now they're trying to retrench as borrowing costs are going up. The US dollar has appreciated significantly, making it more expensive to service foreign-denominated debt. And so I do think there's a bunch of countries in emerging markets and frontier markets that will get into trouble. So the IMF is going to be a really busy place. And then I'll finish a little bit closer to here, again on the sovereign debt crisis theme with Europe. The ECB is winding down its bond buying program at the end of this month. It's a fantastic mistake. That was their only tool for really credibly reducing spreads in peripheral countries. Now that they're going to end it, they only managed to launch it by arguing that deflation was the risk. We don't live in that world anymore, you guys have probably noticed, so it's going to be really hard to fire that back up again. They're trying to come up with a new tool to address fragmentation, but it's going to be really difficult to identify what the targets of that tool are and what the triggers are. Italy, meanwhile, has to roll over about a quarter of its debt over the next 18 months. There's an election by next June. Draghi almost certainly won't be staying around. You may have noticed that Italian spreads have blown out over the past couple of weeks. That's with Draghi in place. He won't manage to get anything done before the elections. He won't stick around, so imagine how investors will treat Italian debt after that. I think that's a big risk to worry about. I'll finish there.
Okay, well, to sum up, return of the Eurozone crisis, emerging market crisis, hard landing, supply chains breaking, QE unwind, this is all quite the list, all happening at the same time. Let me pick out one thing really quickly, and we're going to go to some questions, which is, to Jonathan, perhaps to Philip, perhaps to Nouriel, well, everybody actually. Normally, when you're trying to deal with an inflationary shock, you have models that tell you that the come to equilibrium after you put interest rates up a certain amount, and the model includes unemployment. But when you have a geopolitical situation where an actor seemingly is using the inflation in the West as an active tool and wants to push it up, both energy prices and we hear this morning food prices too, this is a totally different situation, is it not? And therefore, do policy models work? And a bit philosophical, I know, but actually, we're not in a world where inflation is going to come down naturally when, frankly, the Kremlin seems to be trying to push it up as part of its tactic. Am I wrong there? Is that too simplistic?
I'll make a quick comment, if I may, Faisal. So I'm afraid it's well above my pay grade to go through all the sort of geopolitical issues that you're saying. What I think the role of central banks is, given, as you said, Megan, that they can't do anything about what Mr. Putin wants to do with gas supply, the role of central banks is, once that inflation shock wears out of the system, to make sure that inflation then returns to target. And so therefore what we're about, I think, is trying to set interest rates looking forward to a situation when these shocks wear off, to try to get the economy back where it was before.
Okay. Anyone want to come in? Philip, Nouriel, Attiya, on that issue?
Well, just go ahead.
No.
Yeah, I will make the following points. People say central banks cannot do anything about negative supply shocks of a geopolitical type. But last time around we had high inflation stagflation in the 70s, that was driven by two geopolitical shocks. The 1973 Yom Kippur war between Israel and the Arab state that led to an oil embargo, and the 1979 Iranian Revolution led to another oil embargo. And in those cases, central banks and fiscal authority were behind the curve, and was the anchoring of inflation and inflation expectation. So in my view, even if you have a stagflationary aggregate supply shock that's driving inflation, you have no choice, but you have to fight it. Because if you don't fight it by cooling down the economy, maybe even risk of a recession and hard landing, you can end up like the 70s with the worst of all worlds, high inflation and still a recession. So you have to fight inflation and you have to fight the anchoring of inflation expectation. Okay, well, that leads to the next question, which would be, do you think, Philip Hammond, Megan Greene, do you think we see an anchoring of inflation expectations? Obviously, we're hearing that right now from the government here, parochially, in terms of wage bargaining with unions, that's what they're worried about. That's why people can't have pay settlements at the rate of inflation. What do you make of that argument, Philip Hammond?
Well, I think my view is that the UK economy is actually quite fragile at the moment, and I expect that the labour market will soften in the autumn and onwards. And the labour market, of course, has a very different look about it to the labour market last time we faced these kind of conditions back in the 1970s. It's much more flexible. This is much less, I think, about how many people are employed and how many people are unemployed, and much more about, at the margin, how many hours of work, shifts of work are people offering within the labour market. And I would, my guess is that what will happen is that in the UK, we will see relatively limited bargaining power as the labour market softens. And I'm not just saying this because Jonathan's sitting there, but I think the Bank of England is probably on the right track, and we'll see inflation expectations getting back under control during the course of next year. I think the situation might look very different in the US, where I suspect that a more resilient economy and a fundamentally stronger labour market may mean that tougher action is required in order to get inflation expectations back under control.
So, great. I want to take some questions. And I'm going to put another question, if you want to answer that question, and one of Dina's questions, who's an individual member from Chatham House, which is, what will the impact of quantitative tightening look like? So that's the reverse QE process. How does that play out?
Yeah. So just on that previous question about inflation expectations, the most important difference between now and the 1970s is that we've already had the 1970s, and it's put the fear of God in central bankers. And it's not lost on the Fed that it needs to worry about anchoring inflation expectations. That's why they did this big 75 basis point hike most recently. It was largely prompted by one measure of inflation expectations jumping more on a monthly basis than it had in years. And so I do think that they remain anchored, but I also think that central bankers are hugely aware of that. In terms of quantitative tightening, the problem is that we don't understand the implications of balance sheet expansion and shrinking really is on inflation and growth. We understand rate moves much better. So the jury's still a little bit out, right? We haven't done quantitative tightening that much before. We've really had one.
Just basically, if QE seemed to help increase, well, did, asset prices, the reverse of it,
it
put
should
pressure on asset prices.
tighten, it should tighten financial conditions. That's the whole point. But the exact transmission mechanism isn't very well understood.
We haven't done it before. So much. Right, let's take some questions. There's a gentleman just in. Yes. Please identify yourself. Yeah.
Samir Gürsel, Chatham House member. The question to the panel, I will invite them to comment on the neoliberal economy. The crisis we have now, it seems to me, the result of the neoliberal economy started with the monetarist policies in the 80s by Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, and now we're having the fruits of it. Now, would you agree with that? That's the question. And also, isn't it right now the time to go back to what it was, like Keynesian economic system, as the end of the monetarist system now?
Okay, who wants to take that?
Can I try that?
Yes.
And I'll disagree with you respectfully, sir. Sorry, the question was about whether neoliberal economics has had its day. No, neoliberal economics is still very useful. What's important, I think, is that the economy has changed. And if you'll forgive me, Faisal, expand a little bit more on what I was saying earlier on. The economy has changed from being primarily a tangible economy of companies investing in vehicles and buildings and very tangible things, to ones where companies are investing in R&D, they're investing in design, they're writing software, movie scripts, and those intangible things. So the cure for our economic ills, leaving aside the shocks and the disturbances of the war, the cure for our economic ills is not to throw over a whole pattern of economics, if I might say. It's to recognize that we've got a very different industrial structure and react accordingly.
Did Professor Waris want to come in there? I saw you nodding, or was that with agreement or disagreement?
Nodding because I don't think it's ever going to be possible to make a full shift in one direction or the other. I think you have microeconomies, you have community-based economies, and the digital systems have allowed us to actually develop economies, for example, in the African continent, literally across borders that, of course, were never really physically drawn up. But what I do think is that we need to recognize the fact that a lot of these theories that we've been using actually don't have an answer on how to deal with some of the digital issues that are now facing the world. And I think that we have to find measures to fix it. And for me, the solution is really looking at it from a human rights approach. I think human rights has got a great set of principles that allows us to bring in people into the center of the economy and temper whichever economic system we have in place.
Okay, so we've got a couple let's take one here and the lady in the orange dress as well.
Hi, this is preferably for Mr. Roubini. I'm Matt Wolf, by the way, Chatham House member. I was just curious, in the 70s when we had inflation before, Volcker had to raise rates above inflation to bring it down. But today the debt of countries like the US is sort of 5 times higher. And so I was just wondering how they're going to be able to do that, because if they do raise rates, maybe that could cause stability issues for the dollar, and we may be also seeing increasing velocity of money.
Nouriel, do you want to take that one straight away, and then we'll go to that lady?
I think that the gentleman has made a very important point. In the 1970s, we had stagflation, but debt ratios, private and public, were much lower today. And therefore, we overall did not have a debt crisis. We had a debt crisis in the early 80s in Latin America, when they borrowed too much, but was not a global debt crisis. Instead, after the global financial crisis, we had a debt crisis because we had too much debt of the household, of the banks, and so on. But because this was a negative aggregate demand shock driven by a credit crunch, the outcome was one of low inflation or deflation, and therefore central banks would go to zero and aggressively ease monetary policy to address this financial crisis. I fear that today we're going to have the worst of both worlds. We're going to have, like in the 1970s, negative aggregate supply shocks that are persistent, going to lead us to stagflation, recession, and inflation. But we live in a world in which debt ratios are much higher. They've gone from 200% of GDP to over 350% of GDP between 1999 and today globally, much more in advanced economies. And therefore, the risk is not just of stagflation, but of a stagflationary debt crisis. That's why I fear that at some point, central banks that today say we're going to fight inflation are in a debt trap. There is too much debt. Continuing with the policy normalization is going to lead to an economic crash, hard landing, and to a financial crash. And if they give up, inflation goes higher, we may still end up into stagflation. So things are much more difficult today than they were in the 70s after the global financial crisis.
Thanks for that, Nouriel. It's interesting, isn't it? Because we're told that one of the good things about the current situation as regards the UK, Europe, is that the financial system is in much better health than it was 2006, 2007. But you're saying that the tsunami that's coming may breach those defences. The lady here.
Yeah, I'm Korea. I'm a member of Chatham House. I'd love to know, this is a bit of more of a long-term question, but I'd love to know what you guys think of the different financial technologies that are evolving now, like cryptocurrencies, and how the global economic system is going to evolve in the long term with technological change.
Great. I see you're nodding, Megan. That's suggesting that you want to answer the question.
Sure, I can. So I'll just admit my priors. I think cryptocurrencies are interesting securities and terrible currencies. But I do think there are real technological implications, and central bank digital currencies are coming. I think they're absolutely inevitable. But they're designed to treat about 12 different problems, and they're not even necessarily the best solution to any of those problems. So depending on how it's designed, I worry that there'll be sort of a lackluster solution to all of these things, and so consequently won't be as effective as central bankers are hoping. Okay.
It's a great question, and we could have an entire conference about that. Probably Chatham House does too. But let's try and get loads more questions in, because I know that there's a gentleman. Can we have a mic just to the gentleman over here with what I think is a pinkish shirt, but that might be the light. And over there, I note I'm sort of ignoring everyone over there. But sorry, gentleman here, yes.
Yep. Korean Butler from Chatham House. Given the unprecedented sanctions the West had to put in place after the Ukraine attack, particularly freezing Russian central bank assets, what do you think the long-term impact is going to be on the global financial system from doing that?
Okay, well, let me direct that at Philip Hammond. I mean, as a finance minister, as a former foreign minister too, the idea of sanctioning a central bank, which I think we're meant to have sovereign immunity, when I found this, it was an incredible step. Seemed quite effective at the beginning. Its effectiveness seems to be waning a little bit. What did you make of that move? And what do you make of the implications, perhaps?
Well, I agree with you, Faisal. It was an incredible step. And I think the jury's still out, because clearly, if it proves to be ineffective over time, then it's a rather blunt weapon, and perhaps the use of it doesn't look like an effective tool in the future, and therefore the threat of it doesn't change behavior very much. If it were to prove to have been more effective, then very clearly it will change the practices of central banks in countries that may think of themselves as vulnerable to sanctions. But I think that's a much wider group of countries than perhaps we might at first think. There are an awful lot of countries around the world who could envisage themselves being in a situation where they fell foul of the preferences of the leading global financial powers and were therefore vulnerable to any such action. So the proof of the pudding of this is going to be in the eating. At the end of the process, does it look as though central bank sanctions were effective? If they were, then it will have a profound effect on the way central banks manage their reserves in the future.
Including, Philip, Beijing. I guess the point here is you build up these massive reserves as a protection against this type of situation. That was the conscious strategy since 2014 of Vladimir Putin. They were disarmed and managed to find ways around them. What do you think this looks like from Beijing in terms of their massive dollar assets?
Well, they'll also be very concerned, but I was thinking a much wider effect, because there are a lot of countries in the world that do not share the democratic values and principles of those who control the global financial system, who will be worrying that, unlikely as it seems today, they can't rule out the possibility that at some point in the future they may be on the receiving end of similar treatment. And I think they'll be watching very carefully to see how effective this is.
Megan.
Yeah, just quickly, I'd say it's too early to say that the sanctions aren't working, because contracts are signed in advance and paid for in advance. We were never going to see the brunt of the sanctions until the third quarter of this year at the earliest anyhow. But what is the alternative for Beijing, which is feeling uncomfortable about all the treasuries it's sitting on? The euro is hardly a bolt hole, given that Europe and the US have been aligned on this. If you look at central bank foreign exchange reserves, they've migrated away from dollars a little bit into renminbi, but mostly into things like the Canadian dollar, the Korean won. All of those smaller country currencies, A, they're all allies of the US, but B, they're all backed by Fed swap lines in an emergency. So they're effectively the dollar in an emergency. So it's just to say, some people have argued, well, that King dollar is done. It's being dethroned. I don't buy that for a second.
I just want to put a related question here, which was an amazing fact came out of the IMF in April, which was, I'll get this specifically right, they didn't have the official data because it's not entirely clear, but there was more emerging market sovereign debt owed to the Chinese, effectively, than there were to the Paris Club. Yeah. And I thought, wow, that's an extraordinary... And so now that the threat of a debt crisis in emerging markets is just a moment where China makes a big geopolitical play through the tool of its debts.
It's possible. This is what's going to make it so difficult to have any kind of debt workout. You've got the common framework for frontier markets, low-income economies, where China has agreed that it will participate with the Paris Club and they'll all accept the same terms, and the private sector will also participate. Only 3 countries have even started that process. None of them have concluded it. It turns out China is willing to participate, but not necessarily efficiently. And so I think just the fact that China is such a huge creditor and also the types of instruments used for sovereign debt mean that it's much more complicated to come up with a debt workout now than it used to be.
And this is Professor Waris' area of expertise. What do you make of the presence of China as such a major creditor ahead of what might be a sovereign crisis?
So I'd like to just take you back a little bit first, because I was quite interested in the discussions around cryptocurrency. And I think with the sanctions process that's been taking place, a lot of developing countries are seeing it as signs of what could happen in their parts of the world. And perhaps you may not see the effect yet, but the implications have been pretty bad. Many are looking at ways to bypass dollar transactions in their businesses that are domestic and are moving to more direct one-on-one transactions. And the other thing that I have already noticed is that while the sanctions that are being implemented are on the traditional economic systems and of course our monetary systems, of course this is where the crypto system is now bypassing the entire system, because individuals and of course governments now who are setting up these sort of currencies are not going to they're not going to deal with the same problems of sanctions that the countries that have more traditional systems are going to deal with, and it's going to make it a lot messier. But when it comes to debt, I'm not going to comment on China specifically, but what I do want to say is that we are focusing a lot on sovereign debt, but there is a bigger problem also of private creditors. And this is something that we're not taking head on, and it's something that we really need to look at, because while we are getting renegotiation of debt taking place with some states, we're not getting the same renegotiations or moratoriums or discussions with private creditors.
And what a stress to have all of that pandemic debt at the time of rising rates and massive demands on populations desperate to pay their energy and food bills. It's just like a horrible, perfect storm. Let's move to the Eurozone quickly. Again, does anyone want to ask a question about the Eurozone? Anyone want? Yes, okay, gentleman here. Sorry, I'm being a little bit directive. I just want to cover off all the issues. Sir.
From SEPS, from a think tank in Brussels. One element I missed a bit in this panel, which I think was a bit too doomy, was unemployment. I mean, it was touched a bit at the end by Megan and then by the Chancellor, but overall unemployment is very low. I mean, in Europe, it's at an all-time low almost. It's 6.4% in EU, which is enormously low, but also in the UK and the US. So, I mean, are we not moving in another cycle, meaning just because of aging of population, that is unemployment much lower, and that cost for social security system will be much lower in the future?
Jonathan.
Well, we have, thanks for the question, and we have much more resilient labour markets than we used to. So Nouriel talked a little bit about how we're going through a different period in the 1970s. So I think that's one issue. I think what that means, however, is that, and Philip Hammond mentioned this, is that the argument about the labour market has moved away, I think, from unemployment, the kind of raw, you know, are you searching for a job, are you not, to much more sickness, you know, are you available for work? Do you have sick people in your house to deal with? Do you have issues around, you know, your own health and so on and so forth? So I think we need to get a lot smarter when we look at the labour market to look at these other dimensions of unemployment. And that takes us then to the issues around COVID and what's that done to the health of particularly older people in the country, and NHS waiting lists, I have to say as well, and whether things like that and the conditions as we've come out of the COVID crisis, whether they're adding to the pressures on the labour market.
Can I just add, there are 11.5 million unfilled jobs in the US, so you need to see a labour market deterioration before you see a recession. It's going to take a while. That's partly why I don't think we'll have a recession this year, but in the next 12 months.
Nouriel, where are you on the Eurozone in terms of, you know, a repeat of the crisis 10 years ago with the bond spreads blowing out a bit?
Well, there's certainly been a widening of the spreads for Italy and the periphery, and the ECB is going to come out with some anti-fragmentation new facility. The trouble is that this new anti-fragmentation facility may need to be coming with some conditionality. Because if you're looking at the reason behind the widening of Italian or periphery spreads, it's not just market panic or unwarranted spread widening. Italy has low potential growth, has not done much reforms, deficits are high, debt to GDP ratio were already high before COVID, have been rising. And as Megan was pointing out, there is an election coming up, most likely could be a center-right coalition parties coming to power next year. some of which are anti-Euro, anti-EU. So claiming that all of the widening of the spreads of Italy or periphery is driven just by market dynamic, I think is incorrect. And then the question is, which kind of conditionality is going to be necessary, and would that be acceptable to Italy or country of that sort? I think that's going to become an issue where the market are going to test the ECB. We are the
anti-fragmentation tool. Probably got time for another couple of questions. There's a gentleman over there, and a gentleman over here. I'm going to quickly nip in with one with Philip with a question about supply chains fragmenting, friendshoring. I think Janet Yellen's called it, and strategic autonomy is what the French are calling it. You know, this is it? Do we take this seriously? Is this just quite a fundamental move away from globalization, Megan?
I don't think so. You know, there's no metric for globalization, unfortunately, but if you look at all the proxies, if you look at the data, so world trade to GDP is flattened out. It's not crashing. FDI flows between the US and China hit a record high last year. If you look at the hot money, capital flows, they're increasing. Okay. If you look at surveys, US companies, for example, say that they're not planning on leaving China. I think what we're moving towards slower globalization for sure, and also supply chains that are sort of a supply chain plus one, so that there are sort of backup plans for supply chains.
It was quite incredible in the World Economic Forum seeing the sort of bidding war with the semiconductor companies to say sort of, here's billions of pounds, set up your new fab factory, I think that's what they're called, in my territory. And it did strike me this was a change in direction.
I mean, I think Megan's right, and I think we're moving towards slower globalization rather than deglobalization, with the exception, of course, we haven't mentioned Brexit. I think we're beginning to see emerging evidence that Brexit is disconnecting us from our trading partners. The volume of trade is going down. And so if you're looking for a slowdown in globalization, I think you see it right there.
Hi, I'm just going to pick up, you come in a second. I just want to put something to Philip. I mean, obviously, a place like this, we won't talk about, dirty politics, but a question has arisen about the government politically, but economically, one of your former ministers in the Treasury, Jim O'Neill, was on the radio a couple of weeks ago saying, what is the British government's strategic economic policy? Do you think you can identify that as the former Chancellor?
Well, I think as has already been said, the fundamental underlying problem for the UK economy remains one of poor productivity performance, and I think the government does get that. Whether it has an effective and proactive agenda beyond levelling up for addressing that, and I support the levelling up agenda in principle, because one of the drivers of Britain's poor productivity performance is undoubtedly the uneven performance across the country, and the fact that our cities are not drivers of economic growth and productivity. Our cities underperform compared to the performance of cities in other comparable economies. So I think they're on the right track, but I fear that having identified the right approach, it has then been politicized so that the resource available will be misdirected into politically prioritized projects rather than economically prioritized projects. And that, if I may, takes me back to the question I posed at the end of my opening remarks. How do we, in Western liberal democracies, reconcile the undoubted benefits to us all of living in a democratic society with the challenge that we find it increasingly difficult to make difficult long-term, hard long-term decisions? Viewed through the lens of Beijing, for example, we appear doomed to always choosing short-term, easy options and never making long-term strategic decisions. We have to overcome that somehow. We have to find a settlement within our democratic structures that allows politicians to make long-term decisions without then being penalised 18 months later at the polls.
I mean, that sounds pretty profound, Philip Hammond, in terms of that's constitutional change in the UK, isn't it? But maybe we'll take that on again. Let's just finish off with this question from the gentleman over here.
This is going to be a little acidic, but please don't take it flippantly. What would it take for us to decouple from or indeed seriously punish China? Would that be Tibet, Hong Kong, genocide of Uyghurs? I mean, we tried, peace-mongering with Vlad the Mad, and it got us Bucha.
So you're talking about economic leverage with China.
Would we be trading with Hitler if he were genociding Jews? Sorry to be so facetious about this, but it seems that perhaps we need to invest very, very much long-term and see where this is really taking us with China. I just heard Philip Hammond saying that we have to keep them in this order, and I understand, but it's quite similar to pre-Second World War to me.
Okay, well, I'll take Nouriel first. Is the economic... It's a balance. It was a very sort of balanced mutual destruction relationship, wasn't it, in terms of economics between the West and China, or between the US and China, and the holdings of dollars and all that sort of stuff. Who has the leverage in this relationship now? And would it be enough leverage to prevent geopolitical, grab of Taiwan, for example?
Well, it's pretty clear that the relation between the United States and China are getting worse. There is a strategic rivalry. China is a rising power. US is a status power. Some people refer to it as a Thucydides trap. We are at the beginning of some degree of a new Cold War between US and China. And there will be some degree of decoupling. Trade in goods, where there are already restrictions, in services, movement of capital, investment, labor, and also decoupling in technology, data, and information. The question is not whether we're going to decouple, but what's going to be the severity of that decoupling and how fast and so on. Some people go as far as saying that eventually this Cold War may lead even to a military confrontation on the issue of Taiwan. Maybe not this year, but in the next few years. After all, I think Xi Jinping came to power and wants a third term, not just because he wants to do economic reform, but because he wants to pass to history as the president that united mainland China with Taiwan. So relations are getting worse. And that's going to be one aspect of what's going to be, in my view, a process of fragmentation and balkanization of the global economy.
And Philip Hammond, that was sort of addressed to you mainly. Do you want to come back on that?
Well, I understand the question, but I think that, the fundamental difference between Russia and China is that Russia is a small economy attached to a large military arsenal. Russia's economy is about the same size as Spain, and that economy is supporting unsustainably the world's largest nuclear arsenal. China's a different type of player. China is a fundamentally strong player. It's got a large economy and a growing economy, and it's seeking to build strategic power on the back of that. And the US clearly feels, and understandably feels, challenged by that. But I don't see China as a destabilizing force in the way that Russia is, because China's sheer size means that it has a stake in the world order. It may not agree with the structures and the institutions that we have in place, but it has a stake in the world order. And to be honest, I don't think we can realistically talk about simply cutting ourselves off from the world's second largest economy. That doesn't feel to me like real world economics. And I remind the audience again that in democratic countries, we can only ever do what our people will agree to do. We took very tough action against Russia, and that was generally applauded by the population. But did we tell them at the time what it would do to energy prices and food prices? I'm not sure that we did. And I'm not sure that people would be quite so resilient if we leveled with them about the costs to their own standards of living that some of these bold actions will entail.
So I think I'm going to have to wrap that because I'm 9 minutes over, which is terrible timekeeping. I think Megan's got to go. If any of the panelists want to make a quick point, raise your hand now. Jonathan's saying yes. Go on.
I'll make a super quick point, which is the broad point that Philip Hammond was raising about how we deal with these difficulties in democratic society. I think part of it is we delegate some of these tough decisions to independent organizations, such as one that I have the privilege to work for. What we're determined is to not fall into the trap that Nouriel is worried about us wimping out. We're determined to carry on trying to meet the inflation target and doing everything we can to keep the economy stable. Thanks.
Okay, well, we've covered an immense amount of ground. If anybody wants to jump in here, I think I might give it a wrap there. Well, we've covered the entire vista rather rapidly, I appreciate, but please don't go and throw yourself onto the train tracks behind me. But this will give you, I think,
won't get hurt, Faisal. There are no trains.
That is a good point. But it gives you a sense of the challenges, multiple, overlapping, reinforcing, relentlessly, and how it's sort of changing, shifting the pieces of the jigsaw puzzle around the world in real time. And so we thank the panel for just guiding us through some of that. Ask for a tiny bit of pity for me having to explain this to an audience every night without depressing them too much. But thanks again to all of the esteemed panel in just guiding us through some of these currents around the world, from the economy that feed off geopolitics and then affect geopolitics too.